Perched atop the highest hill in the city, the Reed Estate is a magnificent architectural masterpiece where transparent glass walls reflect the fiery red sunset that seems to scorch the entire sky. Surrounded by meticulously manicured gardens, the mansion is not only a symbol of wealth but also an impregnable fortress of isolation. Marble steps lead into the expansive foyer, where an extravagant crystal chandelier hangs from the soaring ceiling. Everything within the mansion exudes sophistication and power, yet it is so cold that no one could ever find true warmth here. The glass walls allow those inside to view the entire city spread out beneath them, but no one, other than Richard Reed, is there to enjoy the view. Simply put, the mansion has never truly known life. Richard Reed, the master of the estate, is a man who has always kept control of everything in his hands. At 32, he is the CEO of Reed Enterprises, a colossal conglomerate in finance and real estate, with thousands of employees under his command. In the business world, he is known as the man with a heart of stone because he has never lost a deal, never allowed anyone to read his thoughts, and above all, never let his emotions sway his decisions. Cold, sharp, calculating. That is how people describe Richard Reed. Love, that is a luxury he believes is not meant for him. There was a time when Richard believed in love, but it was mercilessly destroyed by the very woman he thought would walk with him until the end of his days. Veronica Bennett, the only woman who had ever entered his heart, betrayed him without hesitation, choosing another man, a wealthier, more powerful businessman who was ready to buy her with things Richard never offered, flattery and empty sweet words. The day he uncovered the truth, Richard realized one thing. Love is not worth anything. It is just a foolish transaction in which the one who believes in it will always be the loser. And Richard Reed never loses. From that moment on, he locked away his heart, allowing no one to enter and giving no one the chance to control him through emotions. For Richard, the world only had two types of people: the ones who control, the ones who are controlled, and he was always the one in control. He controlled the company, the deals, the people, and even his own life. Everything was part of a plan, with no surprises, no unnecessary emotions, and especially, no one could ever make Richard Reed lose control. In another corner of the estate, a completely different woman had just stepped in. Vanessa Monroe, 24 years old, was not the type of woman easily subdued by power or wealth. She was intelligent, sharp, witty, and most importantly, she never let anyone dictate her life. She had just taken a job as a maid in the Reed estate, a trial run for her own personal experiments in life. But within just a week, Vanessa had discovered something interesting about her employer. Richard Reed was not the terrifying man people made him out to be. Was he rich? Certainly powerful, of course. But was he the most enigmatic person she had ever encountered? Not exactly. In fact, Vanessa felt that Richard was more like a robot programmed for success, yet had forgotten how to truly live. And that intrigued her. A vast room, bathed in the warm glow of golden lights, reflected in the shimmering glasses of wine, expensive suits, and calculating smiles. The soft strains of jazz drifted through the conversations about markets, stocks, and power. This wasn't just a social gathering. It was where the rich and powerful challenged each other through the most intricate games. At the bar, Richard Reed stood alone, sipping his usual glass of whiskey. His cold gaze swept over the crowd, but he wasn't truly paying attention to anything. Parties like this were no different from a chessboard, where the pieces moved according to a set of rules, and he was always the one controlling the game. There had never been an exception. A familiar voice broke through his thoughts. "You think you can control everything in your life, don't you?" Richard didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Damian Carter was Richard's best friend and also his rival, a successful businessman whose only passion was watching Richard lose. The two of them had bet millions of dollars before on stocks, markets, business deals, but Damian had never managed to make Richard truly fail. And so, at a lavish party in the Reed estate, Damian came up with a special bet, a game not just about money, but about the one thing Richard hated most: love. A smile, unmistakably his, tugged at Damian's lips. the kind of smile that appeared whenever he was about to propose some crazy bet. Richard set his glass down, still not bothering to look at him. Depends on what it is. Damien raised an eyebrow, his eyes gleaming with mischief. Then let's bet. Only then did Richard turn to face him, his sharp gaze as calm as ever. This time, what is it? Stocks? A multi-million-dollar deal? Damien shook his head, offering a faint smirk. Number this time, it's women. The words made Richard pause for a moment, not because he was shocked, but because he despised games involving emotions. Still, he asked calmly, specifically? Damien raised his glass, his tone as if he'd just thought of the most enticing game ever. If you can control a simple woman, turn her into a perfect wife in 3 months, I'll give you $3 million. Richard smirked. Easy. Damien shook his head, his eyes sharp as razors. But if you fall in love with her before the 3 months are up, you'll lose $3 million to me. Richard laughed, shaking his head with disdain. I never fall in love. Both of them turned to look at Vanessa, the new maid of the estate. For Richard, this game was over before it even began, or at least that's what he thought. Interesting. Suddenly a voice rang out from behind. Both turned around, and there stood Vanessa Monroe. Her arms were crossed over her chest, a playful smile tugging at her lips. A high-stakes game like this? And you didn't invite me to join? How hurtful. She didn't seem like the kind of woman who feared power. No hesitation, no shock or outrage, just pure mischief and intrigue. Her eyes were sharp, sparkling as though she had anticipated everything from the start. Damien laughed, crossing his arms over his chest. So, are you daring enough to join? Vanessa shrugged, taking a sip of champagne before slowly replying. Why not? I'm quite curious to see how a cold CEO handles it when he realizes he's losing at his own game. Richard felt a strange shiver run through him, not because of the bet, but because of the way Vanessa was looking directly at him with eyes that showed no fear. He had met many women in his life, the seductive ones, the scheming ones, the ones who feigned innocence, but no one had ever looked at him like that, not hesitant, not cautious, not overpowered by his authority. She knew exactly what she was doing, and that made Richard uncomfortable. Damien broke the silence with an excited laugh. All right, here's what I'll do. I'll tweak the rules a bit. Both of them looked at him with curiosity. Damien smirked, his tone stretched with triumph. If Richard falls in love with you first, he'll lose $3 million. But this time, the money won't just go to me. I'll only take $1 million. The remaining $2 million, Vanessa, will be yours. Vanessa raised an eyebrow, her gaze flickering with amusement. You're turning me into a prize now? Damien burst out laughing. Number, I'm just making the game more interesting. Now you have a huge incentive to make Richard fall for you, don't you think? Vanessa laughed softly. To be fair, I was going to do that from the start. Her response made Richard pause for a second. No one had said she had to participate. No one had forced her, but she had willingly entered this game, fully in control of her own decision. And that was what made him most uneasy. He was supposed to be the one controlling the game. But in that very moment, looking straight into Vanessa's eyes, Richard had a sinking feeling. The game had officially begun. And for the first time in his life, Richard Reed was uncertain about the outcome. Because for the first time, he didn't know who was truly in control of the game. Life can be overwhelming, but here, we share heartfelt tales to bring you peace, joy, and inspiration. Your support, every comment, like, and follow, means the world to us. It motivates us to create more meaningful and uplifting stories just for you. Did our latest story touch your heart? Leave a "I am happy" in the comments if you agree. Subscribe now and be part of a community that spreads love, kindness, and positivity. Let's make every day a little brighter together. The wedding of Richard Reed and Vanessa Monroe was held at the Grand Royal Hotel, a place so exclusive that only the most powerful and wealthy families could step foot inside. White roses lined the aisle, gold-trimmed chairs were arranged neatly, and the light from hundreds of crystal chandeliers cascaded down, creating a stunning yet cold atmosphere. just like the nature of this marriage. There were no sweet words of love, no gentle gazes or tender touches, only a $3 million bet and a game with an unclear winner. The ceremony proceeded smoothly to the point of boredom until the vows were about to be exchanged. Vanessa was supposed to simply answer with one word, I do. But instead of letting the ceremony pass like a formality, she stepped forward, took the microphone from the host, and with a mischievous smile she spoke. I'm not sure if I can be a perfect wife. The entire room went silent. Richard glared at her, surprised though not entirely uncomfortable. All the guests, from powerful business tycoons and billionaires to the media, turned their attention to the new bride. Vanessa tilted her head slightly, her eyes mischievously scanning the room before continuing. But I'll definitely be an interesting wife. A beat of silence. Then laughter erupted throughout the hall. The guests, accustomed to arranged marriages, couldn't help but be drawn in by this bold and arrogant declaration. Damien, the one who had initiated the game, laughed heartily, raising his glass in a toast. This marriage looks more interesting than I thought. Meanwhile, Richard stood still, his gaze growing sharper, but deep down, there was a strange feeling, a sense of something like enjoyment. He hadn't expected her to break the script. She wasn't a puppet he could control at will. As Vanessa stepped down from the stage, she turned to look at Richard, giving him a playful wink. Did you like my vows? Richard furrowed his brows, his voice low in warning. Are you trying to cause trouble on our first day? Vanessa smiled faintly and shrugged. No, I'm just making sure everyone will remember this wedding. Don't you think so? Richard reached out, his hand sliding to her waist to guide her out of the ceremony hall, but Vanessa leaned in, whispering in his ear. You know, I think this game would be a lot more fun if you tried to be a little romantic. Richard tightened his grip, not out of anger, but because of the strange feeling that was creeping inside him. He was used to women trying to please him, trying to keep up a perfect facade to become the ideal wife. But Vanessa had no intention of doing that. The party continued with fine wine, soft music, and conversations about billion-dollar deals. Vanessa wasn't sitting beside Richard like a typical bride. She walked around chatting with the guests, making them laugh with her witty remarks. She drew attention effortlessly without even trying. Meanwhile, Richard sat at the main table, silently observing. She wasn't the type of woman who chased after wealth. She didn't shy away from power. She wasn't trying to win his favor. And that, in a strange way, made Richard feel uneasy. Go kiss the bride. In the middle of the party, Damien raised his glass and tapped it lightly with his finger, his voice full of excitement. Kiss the bride, Richard. Let's see if you can be the perfect husband. Applause erupted from the eager guests who were waiting to see this little performance. Vanessa tilted her head, looking at Richard with a provocative gleam in her eyes. So, darling? Are you up for it? Richard didn't like being put on the spot. He placed his glass down, gripped her waist, and pulled her closer. Vanessa didn't step back. She looked straight into his eyes, her half-smile still in place. Richard leaned down, but just as his lips were about to touch hers, Vanessa suddenly turned her head, avoiding the kiss, then whispered in his ear, Not so fast. I prefer to drag the game out a little longer. She stepped back, flashing a bright smile at the guests as though she had just successfully teased Richard. Damien laughed loudly while the other guests joined in, amused. Inside, Richard felt something stir, an almost imperceptible yet undeniable sense of losing control. She was running the game right in front of him, and that made him feel both frustrated and dangerously intrigued. As the party came to an end, Richard escorted Vanessa to the car, driving her back to the Reed estate where they would officially begin their 3-month marriage. He sat beside her in silence for a long while before finally speaking. I don't know what you're trying to do, but remember this, Vanessa. I'm the one who controls this game. Vanessa raised an eyebrow, turned to face him, and let out a soft chuckle. Oh? Well, I think we should wait and see until 3 months from now. I've already planned to spend that $2 million. The car sped off into the night, carrying two people with two very different goals. Richard wanted to prove he could control Vanessa. Vanessa wanted to prove that no one could control her. The real psychological game had officially begun. The Reed estate had never shown any sign of real life. Long hallways were lit by cold, distant lights. The glass walls were so perfect, they seemed untouched by dust. Every piece of furniture exuded opulence but lacked warmth, just like its owner. But ever since Vanessa Monroe stepped into the house, things began to change. It wasn't noisy or chaotic, but slowly, the Reed estate started to feel alive in a way Richard couldn't quite explain. And the worst part? He couldn't control it. Richard was a workaholic. Even after the wedding, he still spent most of his time in the office, avoiding any unnecessary emotions, just like he had done for years. But Vanessa wasn't the type of woman who would just let him do that. One night, when the lights in the office were still on late into the night, Vanessa suddenly pushed the door open and walked in. Without a word, she grabbed a pillow and threw it straight at his head. "Go to sleep or I'll charge you for private health care." Richard looked up, frowning. "What did you just do?" Vanessa shrugged, leaning her hands on his desk. "I just saved the CEO of a billion-dollar company from a stroke by overworking himself. You should thank me." Richard smirked, but instead of arguing, he grabbed the pillow, set it aside, and went back to his work. Vanessa shook her head, then placed a tray of food on the desk. "I figured you'd be this stubborn, so I came prepared. Drink this with some seed milk." For Richard, business parties were opportunities to maintain his image and seal billion-dollar deals. But there was one thing he forgot. Vanessa wasn't the type of woman to follow the script. At a grand gala, as the two of them made their entrance in front of hundreds of guests, the journalists surrounded them, waiting for some tender moment to capture. Vanessa leaned in close to his ear, her voice laced with mischief. "If anyone asks why we got married, I'll say it's because you owe me $2 million and you're selling yourself to pay off your debt." Richard froze for a second before turning to look at her, his eyes full of warning. "You dare!" Vanessa smirked, but before she could say anything more, a reporter approached. "Mr. Reed, could you share the reason why you chose to marry Vanessa Monroe?" The entire room fell silent, all eyes fixed on them. Vanessa smiled lightly, raising an eyebrow as she looked at Richard, waiting to see how he would respond. He felt his palms tighten, but then his lips curled into a cold smile. "She's the most interesting woman I've ever met. Not words of love, not flowery speeches, but enough to make the entire room erupt in intrigued amusement." Vanessa nodded, seeming satisfied. "Nice lie. I'll give you an 8 out of 10. Richard never expected that. With his answer, for the first time in his life, a woman would make him feel like he had to be on guard in his own game. One day, Richard placed an unlimited black card on the table and slid it toward Vanessa. "You can buy anything you want." He thought she would happily take it, just like all the other women. But Vanessa glanced at it for a second, then picked it up, twirling it in her hand before handing it back to him. "Thanks, but I prefer spending money I earn myself." Richard blinked. "She refused?" Vanessa smiled softly, propping her chin up as she looked at him. "But don't worry, I'll get my $2 million from you sooner or later." Richard felt something stir inside him, not because of the money, but because of her unpredictability. Vanessa wasn't under his control. On the contrary, he was being swept up by his own rhythm of life. She wasn't trying to win him over, but she wasn't letting him manipulate her emotions either. She lived in his mansion as if it were her own, and more than that, she was changing him in some way. And the most dangerous part? He liked it. He began to look forward to her teasing. He started to feel uneasy when she wasn't around. He began to feel out of control. And that was something Richard couldn't accept. Richard Reed didn't have the habit of eating dinner at home. Most of the time, he ate at the office. A quick dinner, sometimes just a cup of coffee, and then he'd continue working late into the night. To him, food wasn't something important. Only work mattered. Only power mattered. Only the numbers he needed to control. But tonight, for some reason, he came home early. He wasn't exactly sure why. Maybe because he finished his work ahead of schedule. Maybe because the final meeting had been canceled. Or maybe because of a scent that wafted through the mansion as soon as he walked through the door. Richard didn't spend time in the kitchen. To him, it was a space for the staff, not somewhere he needed to concern himself with. But tonight, his feet unconsciously led him in that direction. He stopped at the doorway, his gaze slowly scanning the scene before him. Vanessa stood in the large kitchen, a simple apron tied around her waist, one hand stirring food in a pan, while the other lifted the lid of a pot to check on it. The aroma filled the air, enveloping the space like some kind of magic. It wasn't like any dish he'd ever tasted in Michelin-starred restaurants. It wasn't the luxurious, elaborate meals that the upper class often served at banquets. It was a warm, familiar scent, something that reminded him of the concept of home, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Vanessa sensed his presence, but she didn't turn around right away. Instead, she continued cooking, her voice calm. "You're home early? I'm guessing it's not because you missed me?" Richard crossed his arms and leaned against the doorframe, raising an eyebrow as he looked at her. "I don't have the habit of eating dinner at home." Vanessa smiled softly, taking two plates from the kitchen cabinet and serving the food. "Yeah, I know. The butler said you almost never have dinner here." She turned around, setting one plate on the table with a challenging look in her eyes. "But tonight, I made a bit more. You should try it." Richard glanced at the dish on the table. It looked simpler than the kind of meals he was used to seeing at lavish banquets. No caviar, no truffle sauce, no expensive ingredients used to flaunt wealth. Just a steaming plate of pasta with a creamy sauce and fresh seafood. He could smell the rich, savory scent. A hint of butter, garlic, and something he couldn't quite name. But he had no reason to sit down. He wasn't hungry, so he simply shrugged, his tone indifferent. "I'm not hungry." Vanessa wasn't surprised by his response. She slowly placed the fork on the table, crossing her arms in front of her chest, tilting her head as she looked at him, her eyes glinting with a challenge. "Oh, CEO Richard Reed is turning down a free meal? How unfortunate." Richard smirked. "What are you trying to do?" Vanessa took a step closer, pulled a spoon from the drawer, scooped up some of the sauce, and held it out in front of him. "Try it. If you don't like it, I'll leave the kitchen immediately." Richard stared at her. Was she playing with him? He'd met countless women in his life, but none had made him feel like he was the one being manipulated in this game. He wanted to decline again, but the aroma of the dish was genuinely making him second-guess himself. And the worst part, he was actually curious. Finally, without saying another word, Richard bent down, slowly tasting the sauce. 1 second. 2 seconds. Vanessa leaned on her hand, smiling lightly, as if she had already anticipated the outcome. Richard didn't say anything, only slowly licking his lips, as if savoring the lingering taste. And that was when Vanessa knew. She had won. She took a step back, leaned against the kitchen counter, crossing her arms with a teasing tone. "Is it so delicious that you can't even speak?" Richard glanced at her, his expression somewhat perplexed. She knew how to challenge him. She knew how to make him lose control. She knew how to turn the tables without using money or power. And now, she even made him want to come home just for a simple meal. Dangerous. Too dangerous. Vanessa smiled softly, tilting her head as she looked at him, her voice laced with meaning. "If I can make you addicted to my food, then other things won't be so hard, will they?" Richard felt something inside him starting to crumble. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he still had control over this game. Because Vanessa Monroe had turned him into her addict in a way he couldn't resist. Richard had always been in control. He could predict every move, kept himself detached from emotions, and most importantly, he never felt jealousy. Jealousy was a weakness, a feeling for the weak. At least, that's what he thought, before Vanessa stepped into his life. She didn't try to win him over, didn't pretend to be obedient, didn't fear him. She was free, captivating, and the most dangerous part, she belonged to no one. That night, a grand business event took place at the Grand Imperial Hotel, gathering the most powerful figures in finance. Richard arrived with work on his mind, but for the first time, his focus wasn't entirely on deals. His attention was on one person, Vanessa. She didn't walk beside him as a dutiful wife. Instead, she moved freely around the room, chatting with people with an effortless confidence. That made her more dangerous than anyone. Richard didn't like this. But the real irritation flared when he saw a man standing too close to her. Far too close. Daniel Hart, a promising young entrepreneur, was laughing with Vanessa in a way that Richard couldn't accept. He leaned in, whispering something in her ear, making her laugh. Richard gripped his glass tighter, feeling a heat spread throughout his body. What the hell was he doing? She was just part of the bet, just a game. There was no reason for him to feel uncomfortable. But then Vanessa suddenly turned and looked at him, as if she could feel his gaze from across the room. And just before Daniel could say anything more, Vanessa did something Richard never expected. She walked over, one arm wrapping around him, leaning slightly into his chest in front of everyone, smiling brightly as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Sorry, buddy, but I've already bet on this guy." Daniel blinked, surprised, but quickly laughed. "Oh, looks like Richard's the lucky one." But Richard didn't hear anything else. The entire room seemed to blur for a moment, because the feeling that Hug gave him disoriented him. She wasn't acting, or at least, if this was an act, she was performing it so well that he couldn't tell what was real and what was fake. His heart raced. He didn't like this. The party ended, and they returned to the Reed mansion, but Richard couldn't sleep. He sat by the bed quietly watching Vanessa sleep beside him. The dim light from the night lamp cast a soft glow on her face, making her features appear even softer and more serene than usual. No mischievous smile, no sharp remarks, just a woman lying there in his world. And that was when he realized the harshest truth. He had lost, not in business, not in some billion-dollar deal, but in the very game that he himself had set the rules for. He had fallen for her, the woman who was sometimes playful, sometimes soft, sometimes gentle, who had pulled him in ways that were uncontrollable and unpredictable. He had lost himself. He was no longer Richard Reed, the cold, emotionless man. He had completely lost control around Vanessa. And the most important thing? He didn't want to control her anymore. He just wanted her beside him, not for the game, not for the money, but for her. For the first time, Richard was afraid. He had lost love once before in his life, and he had sworn never to let that happen again. But this time, if he lost Vanessa, he wasn't sure he could face himself anymore. He reached out, gently touching the soft strands of her hair. "What have you done to me, Vanessa?" No answer. Only the steady rhythm of her breathing and an unchangeable truth. He had fallen in love with her. That morning, the Reed mansion was unusually quiet. There was no sound of water running from the bathroom, no hint of coffee drifting from the kitchen, no soft footsteps echoing down the hallway, no mischievous laughter, no familiar teasing words, only an endless emptiness. Richard woke up, instinctively reaching out to the side of the bed. But it was cold. Vanessa wasn't there. A cold shiver ran down his spine, something unclear, but terrifying enough to make him immediately sit up. He quickly got out of bed and rushed to the closet. No sign of her clothes. He ran downstairs to the living room. No trace of her. The kitchen. No breakfast waiting for him. She was gone. No goodbye, no note, no explanation. She had vanished. Richard pulled out his phone and quickly dialed her number. "The number you have dialed is currently unavailable." The familiar message echoed in the silence, but this time it felt like more than just an innocent announcement. It felt like a knife stabbing straight into his chest. He dialed again. The second time, the third, the 10th. Still no response. A real sense of panic began to squeeze his mind. He frantically searched the mansion, as if she were just hiding somewhere. As if he searched long enough, she would appear in front of him. "Vanessa!" No one answered. No text message. No note left behind. Not a single sign that she had ever existed in his world. She had disappeared like the wind. Richard couldn't accept it. He mobilized all his resources to find Vanessa. He called Damien. Where did she go? Damien, the one who was always teasing and mocking him. But today, he sighed. "I don't know, Richard. She didn't tell me. But I guess she left because you won." Richard gripped the phone tightly, his chest tightening. "No way. She can't just disappear like this." Damien chuckled dryly, but his voice carried a harsh truth this time. "Why not? Did you never consider the possibility that Vanessa might actually win this game?" Richard hung up the phone immediately. He refused to believe it. He refused to accept that he had lost. He called in a private investigation team. He scoured every security camera, checked every bank account, and searched for any trace that might lead him to her. But everything was empty. Nothing. No financial transactions. No flight tickets. No one had seen her. Vanessa had disappeared as though she had never existed. For the first time in his life, money and power couldn't get him what he truly wanted. For the first time, Richard Reed realized that he was completely powerless. He tried to bury himself in work. He stayed late at the office, signing contract after contract. He reminded himself, I lived without her before. I can keep going. But when he returned to the Reed mansion, the place that had once been his kingdom to control, it was empty. No more warm dinners that Vanessa used to cook for him. No more mischievous teasing that drove him crazy. No more her. Just Richard, a loser in his own game. Richard sat down on the sofa where Vanessa used to curl up with a book every night. He closed his eyes, recalling the image of her bright smile when she teased him and made him uncomfortable. He could still smell the faint scent lingering on the pillow she used. He remembered her voice. He remembered her eyes. He remembered the gentle embrace she'd give him every time he came home. And that was when the pain erupted. For the first time in his life, Richard felt an emptiness that nothing could fill. For the first time in his life, he couldn't control himself. For the first time in his life, he was truly afraid. His first love had left him before, and he had thought that was the greatest pain he'd ever endured. But this pain was 100 times worse. Because Vanessa hadn't just entered his life, she had become a part of him. And now she was gone. Richard leaned back, staring at the ceiling. She was supposed to leave. He was supposed to win. He should be happy, but he felt nothing. Money no longer mattered. Power no longer had any meaning, because the one thing he truly wanted to have back had disappeared. He had lost, not just $3 million, but his own heart. And for the first time, Richard Reed understood what it truly meant to lose everything. It had been a week since Vanessa left. The Reed estate had returned to its usual silence, except this time, it wasn't peace, but an emptiness that couldn't be filled. There were no soft footsteps echoing through the halls, no playful jabs that made him lose control, no hot meal waiting for him at the end of the day. Only Richard Reed, a man who had lost in the game he himself created. He had searched everywhere, used all of his connections, but there was still no trace of Vanessa. For the first time, Richard truly felt the weight of loss, and the only thing he could do was wait hopelessly. That morning, a light rain cast a dull gray over the Reed estate. Richard sat in his office, his lifeless gaze fixed on the pile of paperwork in front of him, but not a single line registered in his mind. Then, knock, knock. A knock echoed from the door. He didn't react. But then the butler's voice came from the other side, filled with an unusual surprise. "Sir, there's someone here to see you." Richard still didn't respond. There was no one he wanted to see right now. But then a voice rang out, the one voice that could make his heart stop for a second. "Good morning, my love. Aren't you going to open the door?" The world seemed to shatter. Richard sprang to his feet, stunned. He rushed to the door, nearly forgetting to breathe. And as soon as the door swung open, Vanessa was standing there, slightly wet from the morning rain, her hair loose and natural, yet still wearing that mischievous smile that drove him wild. She had come back. She was here. She was really here. Vanessa Monroe, the woman who had disappeared from his life for the past week, leaving him with days that felt meaningless and an emptiness that nothing could fill, was standing right in front of him. Richard couldn't believe it. For the first time in his life, he feared this might be an illusion, a cruel joke his mind was playing after days of desperate searching for her. But no, she was standing there, right outside the estate, her familiar blue eyes staring directly at him. His breath caught, his heart clenched in pain. Richard didn't think. He didn't care why she had come back. He didn't care if she was going to leave again. He didn't care about any reason. All he knew was one thing. He couldn't lose her again. Without a word, without hesitation, he stepped forward and pulled her into his arms, held her tight, as if afraid that if he let go, she would vanish instantly. Her warmth made him tremble. Her scent was so familiar it hurt. Her heartbeat quickened beneath his hand. It wasn't an illusion. She was truly back. Richard held her even tighter, burying his face in her hair, breathing in deeply, as if trying to engrave this moment into every cell of his body. His voice cracked, breaking, as the emotions that had been buried for the past week finally burst out. "I was wrong, Vanessa. I was wrong about everything." His breath shuddered, his whole body overwhelmed by a mix of pain and relief. "Please, give me a chance to love you. Not because of a contract, not because of a bet, but because I truly love you." He spoke each word as if he didn't say it now, he would lose the only chance he would ever have in his life. For the first time, Richard Reed, the man who never showed emotion, the man who never admitted defeat, had completely surrendered to love. She didn't push him away. She didn't reject him. She didn't mock him for showing weakness. For the first time, Richard thought that maybe, just maybe, she finally understood how serious he was. She stayed silent for a few seconds, letting him hold her tight, as if she, too, could feel all the pain, longing, and desperation he had been through these past days. Yes, Vanessa was back. He had thought this was a victory, but then she lifted her head. Her familiar blue eyes sparkled with a mischievous glint. And then she laughed. "Are you sure? Because I remember you owe me $2 million. Richard stood frozen. For a moment, he couldn't process the words he'd just heard. "I owe her?" Right. The game. The betting rules. $2 million. He had lost, and she remembered that better than anyone. Richard felt his jaw tighten, his eyes darken with a complex mix of emotions. Is she joking with me? For the past week, he had gone insane over her, searching everywhere, feeling as if the world had fallen apart when she disappeared. And now, when he finally found her, the first thing she says is to demand payment? He clenched his jaw, his breath coming faster as he tried to calm the anger rising within him. "Really, Vanessa? I'm begging for your love, and you're talking about money?" Vanessa raised an eyebrow, crossed her arms, and her gaze was full of challenge. "The rules of the game are still in effect, right?" Richard glared at her, his chest heaving with frustration. She really could drive him crazy, literally. No woman on this earth could make Richard Reed, the cold-hearted CEO with absolute control, lose his composure like this. But Vanessa could. And the most dangerous part, she knew it. He gave a powerless laugh, nothing surprising. Of course, she was still Vanessa Monroe. Still the only woman in the world who could make him lose control. Still the only one who could make him furious, and yet he couldn't stop loving her. He gritted his teeth, took a deep breath, and stepped back. Fine. No argument, no competition, no more trying to control this situation. If she wanted the $2 million, he would give it to her. He turned, walked into his office, opened a drawer, and took out a checkbook. He placed the pen on the paper, wrote down the amount, tore the check off, and handed it to her. "Here, $2 million, just like you wanted." Richard stared at her, challenging her to take it. If this was the reason she came back, then take it. But deep down, he hoped she wouldn't. That everything wasn't just about a bet. That she didn't come back for the money. He wanted her back for him. But even if she did take the check, he would still hope she would give him one chance to love her. Vanessa glanced at the check in Richard's hand. It lay there, a clear testament to his defeat. $2 million. A sum that meant little to Richard Reed. But for a man who was used to controlling everything, being forced to write this check was a failure he had never anticipated. He stood there, eyes locked on her, shoulders tense, as though waiting for her to take the money and leave, waiting for her to prove that it was all just a game, waiting for her to crush his heart in the most brutal way. But Vanessa didn't do that. She didn't rush. She didn't explain. She didn't need to say much at all. Instead, she stepped closer, slowly but surely. Richard remained still, but his entire being seemed to be pulled toward her. With each step Vanessa took, his breath slowed, a feeling of both anticipation and unfamiliarity creeping into every fiber of his body. She raised her hand, gently brushing his cheek. Her finger glided lightly across his skin, warm, soft, but with an underlying danger. Richard felt the storm inside him rise with force. He had once controlled the world, but in this moment, he couldn't control himself. Vanessa softly tugged him down, her breath grazing his lips, so close it shattered every thought he had. "No need for the money," she whispered, her voice softer than ever before. Richard stiffened. His heart pounded fiercely, as if it might burst out of his chest. But she didn't stop. She placed a finger over his lips, silencing any words he might have said. "I only need you." Then she kissed him, not hurriedly, not hesitantly. There were no barriers between them anymore. The kiss ignited, passionate, carrying all the words that had never been spoken. Richard stood still, as if the entire world had stopped the moment her lips touched his. Outside, the rain might have been falling. $1 billion deal might have been waiting for him. A meeting might have been taking place, but nothing mattered anymore. Richard wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her closer, holding her tight as if she were the only thing that still existed in the world. She had entered his life like a storm. She had broken every rule he set. She had made him love in a way he couldn't control. And now she had won. He no longer cared about the game, no longer cared about the rules, no longer cared about anything else. He only cared about her, the one person he was willing to bet his entire life on. This time, there were no conditions, no 3-month contracts, no games. Only Richard and Vanessa, two people, two hearts, truly belonging to each other. They were starting over, like strangers discovering each other for the first time. But this time, there were no boundaries, no doubts, no calculations. Just evening walks under the city lights, where Richard held Vanessa's hand tightly, afraid of losing her again. Just warm dinners at the Reed estate, where Vanessa continued to cook in a way that made Richard addicted to her more than anything in the world. Just long conversations that stretched into the night, where Richard was no longer a cold CEO, but a man learning how to truly love. And above all, one thing was certain. They weren't playing games anymore. On a starry evening, Richard took Vanessa to a garden filled with warm golden lights. Not extravagant, not noisy, not needing the world to witness it. Only one person was needed, the one he loved more than himself. Richard knelt before her, without hesitation, offering a ring that shimmered with silver light. Not because of a bet, not because of a plan, not for any reason other than the purest love he had ever known. This time, there's no contract, no clauses, no 3-month term, no games. He looked her straight in the eye, his gaze full of sincerity. "Only love, and I'm betting my whole life on you." Vanessa looked at him, her smile radiant, but her eyes glinted with the familiar, mischievous spark. She tilted her head slightly, pretending to think. "No termination clause?" Richard chuckled softly, gently squeezing her hand. "Never." Vanessa looked at him for a long time, and then finally nodded. "Then, I accept." Richard didn't wait another second. He stood up, pulled her into a tight embrace, and kissed her deeply, a kiss with no barriers left. Only a man loving a woman with all his heart. And for the first time in his life, Richard wasn't afraid of losing anymore, because he had won the most important thing. He had won Vanessa Monroe's love, and this time it was never going to be a game again. The lesson learned from this story is that true love cannot be bought with money, power, or anything else in the material world. Love is something that cannot be controlled or manipulated through games, contracts, or bets. It comes from the heart, from sincerity, from genuine emotions and mutual acceptance without conditions. Richard Reed, despite being a wealthy and powerful man, could not buy Vanessa's love with money or agreements. He had to learn to let go of control and understand that true love can only come when both parties are willing to give each other trust, affection, and sincerity. The story emphasizes that while we may achieve many things in life, when it comes to love, the most important thing is authenticity and true commitment. Love is not something that can be bound by terms or conditions. It is something that can only come when we are truly ready to open our hearts and accept another person as they are, without expecting anything in return. Thank you for following this heartfelt story of soul. Share your thoughts about the story in the comments below. If you believe that true love can withstand all trials and sometimes begins in the simplest of ways, don't forget to hit the like button and share this story with your friends. To never miss out on touching and meaningful stories, Subscribe to our channel and help us spread messages of love and warmth to everyone. Let's cherish the beautiful moments of life and love together.